Call to order the Ordinance Review Committee, February 4th at 5 p.m. Let's stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I think the first order of business is to approve the minutes from January 7th, 2026. Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, discussion? No? Okay, the meeting minutes are approved. Okay, so we have some old business, looks like the draft table of contents, which I think was updated per Betty. I think that's pretty self-explanatory for the most part. Does anyone want to take a minute to review it or look at it, or have we seen it already?
So, and I'm sure this might change. I mean, this is going to change, obviously, as we're going along, so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress. I mean, there's no doubt about that, but as long as seems like we're making progress. Okay. All right. I think we can probably move on from that, and we'll just jump right in. We do have Meredith here. She is going to help us with legal and anything else, and I have asked Betty to kind of jump in and kind of help move the meeting along in a productive manner so that we don't keep Meredith on there for much longer than we need her.
Yeah, so in your packet that you have tonight, I had sent Meredith what we reviewed at the last meeting before I had reformatted it. So in your packet tonight, there are two documents that she sent this afternoon with her comments and suggestions. The first one is on the top, it's blue, it says 17226, BL recommended revision of chapter 1. And then the other document is also dated at the top, 17226, 2026, non-conforming chapter. So I think the best approach is if Meredith might just kind of take the stage and go through. So anything that is in green is either comments or answers to our questions from the last meeting. So again, I think best thing, because we haven't reviewed these yet, is to just kind of have Meredith explain them to us and go through them.
Okay.
Cool. That sounds great. Hello, everybody. If you can hear me,
Yep.
let me know if I need to be louder. So I hope you guys can see the comments that were on the side. I use track changes, so things might look a little bit small. But let me know if you have any questions. Basically, what I did was went through the notes that Betty had sent over and the committee's questions that I got from last time and tried to give some answers to those, and then also just add some smaller revisions, as well as, once we get into the non-conforming chapter, some more major revisions, I would say. Nothing too major, but the first chapter wasn't in bad shape at all, in my opinion. So we can just start at the beginning. You'll see in the first section, I just made sure we have 1.1, the short title in there. That could have just been left out. And then 1.2 for the purpose, I thought that was a great idea to split out the list into numbered provisions throughout. I think that makes it a lot cleaner. It makes it easier to cite to. So I think that was a great change. And I made just some small changes here, removing visual, making sure compatibility with the Denmark Comprehensive Plan includes all updated and revised versions as well. And following that, adding in to add a little bit more clarity, federal, state, and local laws and regulations for compliance with all of those as well, besides the ordinance. So just some small changes there, but feel free to jump in if you have any questions.
Was
And
there,
then moving on.
Meredith,
go ahead.
was there a reason for taking out the visual?
Mostly just because I thought scenic resources covered that pretty sufficiently. If you guys feel strongly about it, definitely open to hear more. But I figured it was a little bit repetitive given that scenic resources is already covered, but let me know what you guys think.
Yeah. Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Yep.
All
I
right.
think I can see why you did that, though, because the scenic resources may be things that you're looking at, whereas visual access is more of a line of sight, as far as the way I interpret that.
Right, exactly. That's how I was
Right.
thinking about it too.
So are you thinking it needs to be or not be?
No, I don't think visual needs to be in there. I think it covers everything pretty sufficiently. Again, if you feel strongly about it, this isn't something, I would think is a major issue to include at all. So, let me know if there are other thoughts and you think
Yeah,
it needs
so-
to be included.
I don't think it needs to be there.
Is
It's just-
necessary, but
Yeah, so I think we're all good with that.
Yep. Yep. That sounds good
Okay.
to us.
all right, great. So moving on to section 1.3 for basic requirements. Here I just added a little bit additional language, and throughout any revisions that I was making, I was pretty much comparing to a large number of ordinances from other municipalities just to make sure we cover all the correct language, which I can provide those to. I was focused on maybe 5 or 6 other towns that had pretty good model ordinances. So with Bridgeton being one of them. So we can definitely discuss that more moving forward. So under basic requirements, as you can see, I just added in terms of erected, reconstructed, altered, enlarged, moved, or demolished to make sure that that's covered as well. And then in terms of conforming to the provisions of this ordinance, except as otherwise provided, this was one of the committee's questions about ambiguity in this paragraph, the way it was written before, which I agree. I think it did sound a bit ambiguous. I think it was originally written all uses of land or water areas, whether existing or proposed, and that could be interpreted to require that existing uses have to comply with the ordinance rather than be considered non-conforming. So just to make that a little bit clearer, I played with the language here and included instead, except as otherwise provided in this ordinance for lawful non-conforming uses and structures, just to make that exception very clear that existing uses fall under the non-conforming chapter versus the rest of the ordinance requirements. And then added in no proposed use, so really focusing on any new uses of a building, structure, land, water area, change or expansion of a use, or creation or conveyance of a lot. So again, all new, whether it be buildings, uses, anything that hasn't existed before, shall be for any purpose or in any manner except as permitted within the zoning district in which it is located. Does anyone have questions about that? It might help if you want to take a second and read kind of the question posed and the answer there, but happy to answer any questions about that.
So where you added conveyance of a lot, that's not like a transfer of ownership, is?
So creation or conveyance, I mean, that is essentially a transfer of a lot. If it's being used for a new purpose at that point, or any new structure, any new creation, any new conveyance, is what I tried to distinguish there to make sure that that must comply with any zoning requirements, unless it falls under that exception for non-conforming uses and structures.
Okay, so if there is a non-conforming lot, whether it's vacant or has a structure on it. Just because it transfers ownership doesn't mean it loses its non-conforming, right? Okay.
Right, yep.
Basically grandfather.
So it's a non-conforming lot of record.
Right.
And it stays that way.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
I like your clarification.
Yeah, yeah, no.
Yeah, I think that's much better. It really clarifies.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, good. Yeah, open to comments, but I'm glad that seems a little bit clearer. I definitely agreed with your comment about it being a little bit ambiguous. All right, let me know if we're ready to move forward.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
All right, so moving on to section 1.4, which you'll notice I just kind of updated things to make sure non-conformance, which we'll get to all the formatting later, but I know non-conformance is becoming its own chapter. So now 1.4 will be validity and I can never say that word, severability. And really, I think the committee's questions were just about kind of what that means and what that is and how it fits into kind of a real life scenario. I think that's how I interpreted the question. So really the severability provision, the point of it is that if any one section, one clause, one provision is struck down, so let's say a court finds that to be illegal, just that one piece of the rule. So I made an example here. If it's a height limit that's found unconstitutional or inconsistent with the Maine law, then that provision would be essentially severed or invalidated from the ordinance. But this provision just ensures that the rest of the ordinance remains fully in effect. And then I think there was another question about conflicting rules, which kind of went along more with section 1.5, the next one, for conflict with other ordinances. But we can kind of address that now if there's no other comments about section 1.4.
I think we're good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so for section 1.5, this is regarding conflict with other ordinances, which I didn't make any changes to the ordinance, that section, how it is written now. I thought it covered everything fully. I didn't make any changes there. But really, I think the question was about when an ordinance conflicts with another law or any regulation, any rule. Really, the general rule that we use is that the more restrictive provision controls. So I tried to make a few kind of real life examples here just to make that a little bit clearer. So I used this one. Let's say if there's a county ordinance or a state law that sets a height limit of 40 feet for all residences, something like that. But the town's ordinance sets a height limit of 35 feet. The builder still has to comply with the town's stricter limit, the goal being that we don't want extremely tall buildings. So really the question becomes, what's the purpose of the restriction? And it could be, vice versa. I think I try and show another example for, let's say, an environmental standard. And if that is put in place, a state law to protect conservation land or any, a stream, a lake, whatever it might be, the town can't then allow a less restrictive standard than that. But the town is always allowed to adopt more restrictive standards, and that would have to be complied with for builders under the building code or anything like that, as well as residents. So does that make sense? Does that answer your question? I wasn't sure if that was kind of getting to what you guys were asking.
I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think our concern was, with state laws. If state laws, and especially, I guess, if they're adopted or passed and we don't have anything in our ordinance about that, then the state, somebody could come in then and say, well, this is in the state law. It says I can build, 3 houses and you know, you're only allowing me to build one, and that might not be a great example, but, you know, so I think
Yeah,
that
no, I
was,
hear what you're saying, definitely. Yeah, if there's an area that the ordinance doesn't cover, but state law does directly address, then state law would still govern. They still have to abide by any state laws that would kind of, let's say, fill the space where the ordinance doesn't address that. But if the town decides to adopt something more restrictive, then that would have to be abided by, complied with by any residents. Only really in the case where there's a direct conflict with the rules. So let's say the state limits the height of a building to 40 feet. Again, the purpose being to prevent very tall buildings. And then the town tries to adopt an ordinance that says 45 feet is the height limit. That's not permissible. They would still have to abide by the state law, so under 40 feet. And in any time where it's possible to comply with both, such as the earlier example I gave, so if the state law is 40 feet of the height limit and then the town's is 35, then if you're under 35, you're still completely in compliance with both the state law and the town's ordinance. So it really just depends on whether they conflict, the purpose of, you know, the law, the ordinance, whatever it might be. But yeah, definitely a good question. If there's nothing in the ordinance to address it, the state law would still apply. You can tell anyone who asks that if there's something directly on point in a state statute.
okay.
Yeah.
I think we were all, had the understanding that we couldn't be less restrictive than the state. But I think the question was, what if something, if the state comes up with a law or an ordinance that is more restrictive, then what do we do? And how do we write this in there?
Like the 3 buildings on the lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which we'll be addressing anyways, but,
Right.
Yeah, so you're saying if something is more restrictive and the ordinance, let's say you already have something that says 40 feet is the height limit and the state passes something that's 35, is that kind of what you're asking?
Yes. And so how do we word it in here so that it's pretty clear to people reading it that it could become more restrictive if the state says so?
That's a good.
Is that-
Yeah, definitely.
That's my recollection
I mean,
of our discussion anyway.
Yeah.
yeah, sure. I mean, I'm happy to add additional language in here if you don't think it's clear and, you know, the ordinary person wouldn't be able to understand that really easily. So we could add some language in there under subsection 1.5 to include, you know, maybe an example or just some more specific language demonstrating that. It is a pretty common principle under the law, but of course, yeah, I definitely understand if you think residents might read this and say, I don't really understand what that means. So yeah, I can make a note and add a little bit more clarification there if that works.
Yeah, because I can picture someone reading this and seeing a limit, and then the state comes up with something more restrictive, and then go to Lindsay and say, well, wait a minute, you know, the town says I can do this. So she can point to something to say, if the state comes up with something later, then we need to abide by that.
So is this something
The bottom
that
sentence.
could be put in a paragraph or whatever,
Yeah.
just as a blanket
Last
statement?
sentence on
Because
the 1.5.
it applies to everything, right? All the ordinances.
For what? I'm sorry.
We can go less restrictive, but not more.
Imposes greater restrictions, those provisions.
We can go more restrictive than the state, but we
Correct.
can't go less.
Correct.
But that's like for everything in here, like a blanket statement, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So I will add some additional language
Yeah,
in
no,
there.
I think you're right. I think that does.
Okay, I think
Okay.
we're the last sentence in 1.5. I think kind of lends itself to kind of what the language in which we kind of wanted. So I think that probably will satisfy our concern there.
Okay, great. So no need for additional language. I do think it covers everything. Again, it's kind of a general
Boy, you're-
principle that every municipality, you know, has to abide by. But we can definitely revisit it if you guys think that there is something more that should be added.
Okay.
Okay. Any other thoughts on 1.5?
I'm good.
Nope, I think we're good.
Yeah.
So on 1.6 for amendments, I didn't make too many changes here. I thought this was all generally well worded. It's clear, it makes sense. I think reducing, the number of subsections and subsections, I think that is just overall a good change moving forward. I think it just makes things clearer and a little bit easier to cite, easier for people to find. So I thought all those formatting changes were a good idea. And then really the major changes I made in this section were to 1.6D for shoreland district amendments. And really here, again, looking at other ordinances as models, I just added a little bit more language, making sure it's really clear that any amendments have to go to the commissioner for the DEP. And then clarifying based on the language in the statute, both citing the statute and making sure that it does specify certified copies of any ordinances, amendments, repeals have to be submitted to the DEP commissioner for approval after adoption, and then not effective unless approved by the commissioner. And then any application for a permit or approval submitted to the municipality within such 45-day period shall be governed by the terms of the amendment if approved by the commissioner. So again, just really restating the statutory language and making sure that's really clear on that process. And then on that next page, I added just one other section that I think you guys had already discussed and talked about, just about consulting with the DEP for feedback. I think that's a good thing to include, and making it clear that it's not mandatory, but optional for the review process. I think that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And then one other recommendation I had was something to think about is I saw in several other ordinances that they've separated out any parts of the ordinance, any sections within the ordinance that discuss the shoreland district. So some other municipalities have decided to list those and pull out those sections to make it really clear which ones are affected by 1.6. So something to think about if you think that might add a little bit more clarity. Obviously, I think that would come towards the end as for moving numbers around and things like that for formatting purposes, but just a thought there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Think that's good?
Good.
Yep.
Great. So if no one has any comments or questions there, moving on to repetitive amendments. I made no changes there. I thought that covered everything pretty sufficiently. And stop me if you have any questions on that. And then the effect of repeal or amendment. So this section, I added a recommendation here that this should be included. I saw this again in a lot of other ordinances that I've looked at. And this is basically saying that if a provision of the ordinance is repealed or amended, that repeal or amendment shall not be construed to revive any former provision. So saying, if something is repealed, it doesn't revert automatically back to whatever provision was in place before. Just making that really clear. And the repeal or amendment of a provision shall not prevent enforcement of the repealed ordinance with respect to the acts or conditions occurring during the periods in which it was in effect. So saying if there was, something that happened that violated the ordinance before the repeal, if it had already occurred, the ordinance was still in effect at that time. So there still can be an enforcement action, even if later on it's repealed, as long as the conduct actually occurred before that repeal or amendment occurred. Any questions or thoughts on including this?
I think it helps save
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah, I think we should have that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we definitely
definitely,
have that. Yeah. No, that's a great suggestion.
Anything to make your life easier. Yeah.
Great, okay. So no other questions on that. Moving forward, so effective date, here I just made it more clear, it was very small revision, just adding in the Shoreline District Amendment section, which again is kind of a formatting thing, which we can work on later. But otherwise, effective date 1.9 looked good to me. It didn't make any substantive changes there.
Okay.
And I think that brings us to the end of year one. Do you want me to just continue and go straight into the non-conforming chapter?
Yes, I think so.
I would think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So this chapter I spent a decent amount of time on. Again, looking at a lot of other ordinances to see how they structured things. I think this might be something that we continue to revisit, and maybe it might be helpful if the committee looks at a few other model ordinances. Again, Bridgeton was a good example, and I looked at several others just in terms of how to structure this and making sure that everything that needs to be in here is here. So starting at the beginning, purpose and intent, I made just some small changes here, just including the language or otherwise modified, just covering everything expanded, enlarged, altered, or changed, modified in any manner that increases its degree of nonconformity. And I thought it would be a good idea to include the kind of general rule that once a use or structure is brought into conformity, it can't revert back to a non-conforming condition. Any comments or questions there?
No, I think that's a good addition.
No, that's great.
Yes.
In the first sentence, conformity's crossed out, and then it says conformity.
Oh, it might show track changes kind of funny on yours. I'm not sure. On mine, I just have, are you talking about the first sentence? The intent of this chapter is to promote conformity.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, on mine, I have it correct, so I'm not sure if it was just a formatting issue that popped up. Did you have an issue with that language or beyond it just saying conforming instead?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Nope.
Just want to make sure. Track changes always prints a little funny, so apologies for that. So again, those are the only changes I made at the beginning, and moving forward under general provisions, I thought A for continuation. I think that sounds good. No changes there. I think that's very clear. B for transfer of ownership. I only added the words with the provisions of this chapter, just referring to a change in ownership shall not affect the right to continue a legally existing non-conforming use, and just making it really clear that it remains in compliance with specifically this chapter rather than the ordinance as a whole. Again, kind of going back to that ambiguous provision that we just talked about in chapter 1, just making sure that non-conforming is treated differently. And then for C, maintenance and repair. So you'll see in quite a few places, I've just added the word legally existing non-conforming use, just to make sure that, again, covering all the bases, making sure that that's really clear. We're only referring to what is already considered a legally existing non-conforming use, and anything that doesn't comply with the ordinance as it's written or this chapter as it's written would not be under that. So I added that in several places, and then I didn't add too much else here. Any work required in order to comply with federal, state, or local building or safety codes is also permitted, and adding in the word existing to make it really clear that is referring to the current footprint of the structure. Any questions there? They're pretty minor changes.
No, I don't think so. Good.
All right, and then D kind of goes back to what I added under purpose and intent. So again, just making that really clear as a general provision at the beginning of the chapter, that once a legally existing non-conforming use or structure or lot has been converted to a conforming condition, it can't revert to a non-conforming.
Good.
Right. So non-conforming uses. Here, some of these are mainly just improving the words used in here. It's nothing super substantive in that first paragraph for discontinuance, just making it clear that a discontinuance for any reason, doesn't matter what that reason is. When a non-conforming use is replaced by a conforming use, the non-conforming use shall not be resumed, and that's for the period of 1 year, and any subsequent use after it becomes conforming must comply with all requirements of this ordinance, which I'm almost reading this now and saying this chapter, which I might change that. Does anyone have any questions or comments there?
Nope.
Okay, so for B, structures non-conforming as to use. So here I just kind of included additional language here to show that except for single-family dwellings, the structure with the non-conforming use shall not be enlarged unless the non-conforming use has been discontinued. And then there's the exception for single-family dwellings with a non-conforming use may be enlarged, provided that all applicable dimensional requirements are met. And I added, except in a resource protection district where no enlargement is permitted, just to make that really clear pertaining to that kind of district. Any questions about that?
I like the last sentence. You should too.
No, I think we're good with
Yeah,
that.
that's good.
Okay, great. And then, so for C, change of non-conforming use. Again, just adding in some kind of clarifying language, showing that in approving such a change, the planning board will determine that the proposed use is equally or more appropriate to the district, and adding in the language that it will have no greater adverse impact on the subject property. And then clarifying, instead of surrounding properties and resources, I added in some more specific language there. The water body, tributary stream, or wetland, than the existing use, just to make sure all applicable properties, resources are covered there. And then again, just adding in some additional language to make it clear for the planning board's written findings, and that the performance standards of the ordinance will all apply. Any questions there?
Should we, whether it be here or elsewhere, and I think one other place you had actually said we should list out, and you did list out like what standards we would follow in order to make that decision. So as I read this, I just wonder, how are you going to decide the impact on an adjacent property? So if somebody comes in and says, well, you know, I don't want them to enlarge their non-conforming structure, even if they move it back, 10 or whatever, how do you justify, and what guidelines would you use for that? I mean, it makes common sense that you just can't deny somebody because their neighbor doesn't like what they're going to be doing, but
Yep, no, that's a great question, and that's why I did like that the ordinance already had in there the criteria: public health and safety, erosion and sedimentation, water quality, habitat, all those things. But it was something I was considering, as I know you mentioned you saw where I've added in criteria in other places a little bit more explicitly. And it kind of depends on what structure we want to follow, because I think that's a great point. I think anywhere that we can make it really clear what decisions are based on and what criteria are being used to make the decision, I think is very important. And most of them fall under the same criteria. So I saw in a few other ordinances that they pulled out a section listing the criteria within the non-conforming chapter, and then essentially just citing to that subsection throughout the entire chapter so that it's really clear. Just go back up to where that criteria is listed, because again, it's pretty much the same criteria throughout, which I'll see where I added. Yeah, on X.5 for foundations, that's where I added in some of the criteria there that are typically used. So we could include those criteria separately. That could be an option rather than having to list it in pretty much every section, if that makes sense to everyone.
Yes.
Yeah.
And did you want, on that last line on C, did you want it to say chapter just like in A, or should that say ordinance there?
For that, yeah, we can say chapter. I know I'm still finding a few of those. I just crossed it off in A, so I think we can say chapter there as well. I think that's a good point.
Well, I'm not sure
then
actually in
Oh,
that.
go ahead.
I'm not sure if in this incident, though, it is just the chapter, because if you change a non-conforming use, you also want it to be applicable to any other performance standards, because we have a whole chapter on performance standards. So is that what that would refer to?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I think you're right.
Yep.
Yes, yep.
That's a good point.
Okay, great, so keep that as is. And then, if there's no other questions about that, I did include under the next section just a note about, again, what I was seeing a lot of other municipalities do, which we have a pretty, strict ordinance in here about non-conforming use of land, saying that a non-conforming use shall not be extended beyond the area occupied at the time it first became non-conforming. So this was just kind of food for thought for everyone, if everyone was happy with that, or was open to changing that, because most other municipalities, pretty much every ordinance I saw does allow for some expansion, provided it meets certain criteria, and some require planning board review or CEO approval. So just something to think about, and I put in a sample kind of provision that could be used there if you all think that should be changed. But as written, if you want to keep D the way it is and not allow for any expansion of a non-conforming use, then we can just leave it as is. I think it covers everything that it needs to.
So I think actually the intent of our existing ordinance is that you can expand it as long as you, as long as the planning board approves there is no, impact. And then to the greatest possible extent of meeting any of the regulations, right? The setbacks and.
Yeah, not to exceed the maximum set in place.
Yeah. So I think that we would be wanting to say that they can be enlarged or extended.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's what I figured, since that seemed like the intent of the rest of the ordinance. That's why this one kind of stood out to me a little bit. So we can definitely, I can make that change in there. Any other comments on that? right, so moving on to the next section for non-conforming structures. So I didn't change anything under the general provision at the beginning or under B, expansions and additions. I think that covered everything. I just added a note in here about whether they want to require the applicant to obtain a permit if there is that expansion or alteration, and obviously meeting the criteria that are spelled out in here.
Yes, and I think we deal with that in our existing ordinance under our land use table, but I think it would be good to actually add it within the chapter.
Perfect. Okay, great. I will add that in. Okay. And then for C, shoreland limitations. So here I just added in the language, even if the expansion would not increase the structure's nonconformity with the applicable setback requirements, it's still a pretty, hard rule that no portion of a structure that's located within 25 feet from the water line can be expanded, and just making that very clear that regardless of if it meets, other criteria, doesn't make it more non-conforming, it doesn't matter. And same thing for number 2, just making that, again, additional extra clear here, that even an accessory structure, if that's located closer than the principal structure, there can be no expansion, again, even if it doesn't increase the nonconformity. And then moving forward, so here in D, this is pretty much directly pulled from the statute. So I was also using the DEP's guidelines for shoreline zoning ordinances. They have a pretty extensive document for recommendations for ordinances. And this was pretty much directly aligned with them as well as the statute language. So I just recommended including a little bit more specifically the floor area and height limits, and making that very clear with just reading over it. More than 1,000 square feet or 30% larger for structures located within 75 feet, or on the next page, same thing for structures located less than 100 feet, just making sure that language is really clear rather than just referring to other limits set forth in the ordinance. So I thought that would be a helpful change to include there, just to make sure that that's really clear and everything is covered there. Any thoughts on that?
So our existing ordinance, when we had to adopt the shoreland zoning, when the state brought that out, we actually decided not to use the 30% and only stay with the square footage.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
Which personally I prefer, because it's harder to determine what was existing in 1989 and how many additions have been put on since then. So, which is why I think we just stayed with the square footage.
Got it. No, that makes sense. So do we still want to include the square footage here and just take out the percentage portion of that?
Yes.
So that it's still, okay. So I do think that would be helpful to include. And then the height, that piece, that's fine with everyone. No other changes there, just removing the percentage of the footprint.
Yes.
Great, okay. And then I included at the bottom, making sure that that's still in here in both provisions, that basements shall not be counted towards floor area.
So, and I think this too, and we might deal with this when we're talking about definitions. So the confusion of what is floor area and what is square foot. Because we say 1,500 square feet, but we're saying a basement doesn't count towards floor area. Does that mean it does not also count towards the square footage? Because square footage, I think, is defined as, I don't think we actually use floor area in our definition, right, of square
Living
footage?
space, I think we had.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think
Yeah, I think
So-
it does refer to square footage, and I did a little bit of research on this just to make sure that basements are, there hasn't been any changes, they're still not counted towards square footage. I think that's a great point, and I think we could adjust that to be more consistent with the rest of the ordinance and take out floor area. I think that makes sense.
Unless you're a realtor.
So would you be saying then that they do not count towards the square footage?
Yes, correct. All right.
I think that some other towns put in the reference, what the state statute is, and I like that. Like that people can go and then refer back to what the state is saying, and maybe it helps them to understand it a little better, and I think it also gives it a little bit more meat to say, hey, it's not just us saying this, we have to say this.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think that's a great point. We can add in that site to the statute. I think that's generally just a good thing. Like you said, I think it's always good to show where the authority is coming from, and also giving people another source to go read, confirm, understand the language a little bit more. All right. So any other changes besides those? Okay, so moving on to foundations. So again, this section is, I was looking pretty closely at the DEP's recommendations for what to include in here, as well as what other municipalities have done. So I added in the language, the criteria that we talked about, making sure that's really clear. And again, if we want to pull that out and make that a subsection that's consistently referred to throughout the non-conforming chapter, I think that makes a lot of sense too. And you'll see those criteria under number 4 listed out. And then, let's see. Yeah, I had another revision at the bottom where I just kind of explain some other suggestions in here. So again, I explain incorporating the specific criteria above, and then I also talk about the language, the footprint of the structure is not increased in that first one under A for code enforcement officer authority. I think it was a little ambiguous. I understand it. Which is why I didn't change it, but I thought it would be a little bit clearer to say that the first floor of the structure is not increased, the foundation does not extend beyond the exterior dimensions, rather than just leaving it at the footprint is not increased. I think that just gives it a little bit more meat to it, and gives a little bit more clarity. If anybody has thoughts on that.
So the 3-foot rule can stay?
The 3-foot rule can stay.
Yes.
Yes.
So, yes, I think your suggestion for 1 is much more specific. So I think that's a good.
All right, great. Any other questions, comments on that? All right, so moving forward, the next page, I addressed the committee's question about having the height of the structure is not increased by more than 3 feet as measured from the uphill side of the structure. So I did a decent amount of research to see if I could find anything that would prohibit that. I couldn't find anything. really there was more general height and expansion standards under the shoreline zoning law, but it didn't require or prohibit municipalities from using the language that you have there now. I also saw it in several other ordinances. So I think that makes sense, and I don't think it's conflicting with any state law at the moment. And then the next question, such foundation work shall not be considered an expansion of the structure. So I think we kind of just talked about this a little bit with the total square foot allowance, and how it affects, how it's kind of defined, and how it's affected within the shoreland zones. So I think, again, making that change from floor plan to square footage, I think makes a lot of sense. And the same limits apply regardless of whether the foundation is characterized as an expansion. Again, as long as it doesn't increase, which I think that kind of that new language that I proposed in the previous subsection under foundations, I think that kind of clarifies things a little bit more. But yeah, as long as the foundation doesn't increase the square footage, then it will remain unchanged like we just talked about. Any questions about that?
So then I think this, so it's always the question of what if it's a what if there's living space? So I don't know if we need to clarify somewhere about, because that always comes up. It's, you know, so I'm putting a foundation in, I am going to have it a walkout foundation, but I'm not finishing any rooms down there. So does it count towards my square footage? Right? I mean, we get that all the time.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I can look into it a little bit more. I mean, currently, is there a requirement to get, you know, a permit for if it's considered, you know, finished living space or anything like that? I know some towns do have that requirement in there, because that could kind of help decide when it is counted and when it isn't. I'm not sure if Lindsay has a better answer for that.
So we usually, it's just when because a permit is required, you know, for a foundation under a non-conforming. So we usually guide it to what they submit for that permit. So if at that time they are, you know, putting in extra bedrooms or living space, or then we typically say, well, now you're increasing your square footage because now you're increasing living space. But to say that we could point to something in our ordinance that helps support that, it's kind of gray.
Definitely. So why don't I take a little bit of time, and the next time we can, you know, look at whatever I draft to include something that will clarify that a little bit. If that works, I can do a little bit of research. I'm sure that's a question that's come up before, so. All right. Does that work for everyone if I do that?
Yeah, that's good.
And we can move on next time. Okay, perfect. And then under there, we just have the planning board review required, so I didn't make any changes there. I think that's pretty clear. Obviously, we'll work in what we just talked about as well for that change. And then for relocation, under number 6, so again, adding in the legally existing language for non-conforming structures. And I just reworded this a little bit just to make it a little bit clearer by changing the order of how things are addressed here. The relocation shall not increase the degree of nonconformity, shall comply with applicable setback requirements to the greatest practical extent. And then I added in, which is under the statutes in many places, and ensure that any existing or replacement subsurface wastewater disposal system complies with the state's rules. and then added in just that criteria, just rephrasing things, nothing super substantive there again. And then under that, you'll see that I've added in a recommendation to include some info about vegetation. So if a structure is relocated and it causes damage to vegetation, then most other municipalities have included this language about how that should be addressed. And I know in the ordinance, there's already a section discussing revegetation requirements under 6.8.9, I think is where I found it. But this kind of includes some more specific requirements for replanting trees that are removed, and then same thing with any vegetation, smaller shrubs, grasses, anything like that, which I did see in the majority of other ordinances that I saw. So it might be a good idea and a good place to put this in if people are comfortable with that.
I think it's a good
Definitely.
thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Any questions about that? Good to move on. All right, so number 7 for damage, destruction, and reconstruction. So here again, looking at other ordinances, just trying to make this language a little bit more clear. Again, adding in the legally existing language. I also added in excluding normal maintenance and repair so that it's really clear when they're trying to figure out whether it is, over or under 50% of its market value, that's excluding, general typical standard costs within that calculation, and adding in making sure approval of the planning board is very clear there for A, and permit from the code enforcement officer in B. And then again, making sure that the replacement will occur within the footprint of the structure as it existed at the time it became non-conforming, and will meet applicable setback requirements to the greatest practical extent. And then I know we had that 1 year deadline for an application for a permit, and I just added in the language to be submitted rather than, I think it said obtained, which could be a little bit difficult to defend if someone does apply and, the town is slow or something happens in order to, prevent them from getting that permit. So I changed that to submitted, as I think that makes that deadline a little bit more solid. And then for B, I just asked whether the committee wanted to include a time frame. Other municipalities tended to choose 2 years for damage of 50% or less. We don't have to include a timeline, but just a thought there.
I think it makes sense since we do in the over 50.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, consistent.
So does 2 years sound reasonable to everyone for damage 50% or less?
For obtaining, or I'm just wondering why we would have 2 different ones.
So we could do the same one, definitely. Typically, the way I saw it done was that for damage exceeding 50%, it was a shorter timeline, and then for damage of 50% or less, it was slightly longer, likely because it's less likely to be larger repairs or reconstruction. But we could also do 1 year. We can make them both 1 year. I think that's reasonable as well.
I would just say a year, just to be consistent with one another.
Be easy
Sure.
to keep track of. And,
Yeah.
Plus, it would get done quicker,
yeah,
I mean.
won't
and then we
drag out
wouldn't
for
have-
3 years.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I think 1 year would definitely work. at least on my end. I think that would be great.
Great. 1 year. And we'll just essentially mirror the language that's above in A. And I also just recommended flipping A and B. I think just reads a little bit easier to have damage of 50% or less first. If anyone has strong opinions on that, definitely let me know.
No, I think that's all good.
That's fine. Yeah. No,
Fine.
that's fine.
And then moving on, we're ready.
Yep.
So the next section we have is non-conforming lots of record. So here, the most major change I made to this section was to C, merger of contiguous lots. And this was just really breaking it down into a list to make it really clear what criteria would involve two lots having to be merged, two or more. So starting with A, we'll get to C in a second. Again, just small changes here. Adding minimum lot size, lot frontage, and shore frontage requirements. Just making sure that that's all included for when a vacant non-conforming lot can be built upon. And then for B, built lots. So again, just adding some small changes here and including the same language, minimum lot size, lot frontage, and shore frontage, and that it does not increase the degree of nonconformity. And I didn't see anything else in there that jumped out at me, but let me know if there's something that you all see. And then for C, so as I was saying here, I just made this a little bit clearer, making it clear that it could be two or more lots, and they only have to be consolidated to the extent necessary to meet applicable dimensional requirements. So again, that could be 3 lots in a case, and clarifying that it could be single or common ownership. And at the time or since adoption or amendment of this ordinance. So again, making the timing clear of when merger might be required. And then splitting out that criteria into 1 and 2 for at least one of the lots does not individually meet the dimensional requirements of this ordinance or any subsequent amendment, and at least one of the lots is vacant or does not contain a principal structure. And then adding just some clarifying language for the bottom. This requirement shall not apply where rights have vested or where state law provides otherwise. Any thoughts or questions on that section?
So again, a lot comes up. A lot of our shoreland or shoreline lots are within subdivisions. Way back in the 60s or whatever, they were 50-foot or 100-foot waterfront lots. So what happens if there are 2 lots in a subdivision that is owned by the same person? Do they still merge?
I believe they don't. I was actually just looking at this question. I believe they don't, but I think it is a good thing to be clear in here. So we can definitely, add that in for sure.
And then one other thing that has come up recently, and I don't think we have it covered, is that if there are 2 non-conforming lots that are adjacent to each other, they can be reconfigured, even if they can't be reconfigured to conforming lots. They can be reconfigured to non-conforming lots as long as they meet the standard, the state standard, right? We just dealt with this. And we had to fall back onto the state law that says that can happen.
Because there was 2 principal structures.
Because there's 2 principal structures. So I think it's worth adding.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great idea. So we'll add the piece about subdivisions as well as that. Okay. Anything else there? All right, so next, moving on to vested rights. So again, just making this formatting a little bit more clear and explaining the language a little bit. I think first time I read it, I found it just a little bit ambiguous and making it really clear that non-conforming rights don't arise from just filing an application or a notice of intent, and spelling out the three situations underneath where non-conforming rights do occur. So substantial construction was lawfully commenced prior to the adoption of this ordinance. Substantial construction was lawfully commenced prior to or within 12 months of the adoption of this ordinance, or review of a complete application. And here is where I added in a little bit more information about what a complete application is defined as, just to make sure that that's really clear, as I know that that can be an issue that comes up. So I added in, meaning one that contains all the information required by this ordinance and any applicable state laws or rules necessary to begin formal review commenced prior to adoption of this ordinance, and for which all required state and local permits were validly issued and complied with. So that was more just clarifying the language there. And I think on the next page, I also pull that out and say another area that could be more carefully defined, I think, is substantial construction. I think that's a question we've heard before about what that means, what it's defined as. I'm not sure if it's the best place to incorporate that here or to add that in as a definition under 9.1. That's also an option. But just a thought there. And same thing for complete application. I mean, we could also define it there or include it in both, just to make sure that those are very clear.
I think it's going to make sense, and as we go through this, we've already said that there's going to be, definitions we have to either revisit or new definitions, and so this will be two that we add.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. And then the only other thought I had was moving vested rights up to under general provisions. I think it makes sense as kind of a general rule as it pertains to when non-conforming rights arise at all, which obviously is the purpose of the chapter. So just a thought to moving it there. Again, I think it's fine where it is, but it could be a little bit clearer earlier in the chapter.
It makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Great. And then the only other changes I made, I think the only thing we have left is the shoreline non-conformance summary. So here, obviously the references might change as we adjust the formatting. The only other changes I made was just to get rid of the split of structures and maximum height for the 75 feet from water, since the one below it has 100 feet and lays out, the same thing in one line versus two. So just combining those two for consistency. And then adding in the foundation repair, that elevation increase of 3 feet, as we talked about, measured from uphill side, and including that, again, just reducing, repetitive provisions. And then the last page, just adding in the language that reconstruction is allowed in place only if setback is met to the greatest practical extent, just making sure that that language is kind of repeated, that it's the same place, same footprint as before. Any questions about that?
I don't think so.
So,
I did recommend when I sent out this last packet for tonight's meeting that we also revisit this chapter. After looking, again, I know you have referred to Bridgeton's. I really like the way Bridgeton's is laid out. To the point that they do non-conforming use in shoreland, non-conforming outside of shoreland. So I agree, I think we need to revisit this whole non-conformance chapter.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And when I was looking at, other ordinances for other municipalities, a lot of them kind of broke out the shoreland section similarly to Bridgeton. So I thought that was a good way of doing it and making it a little bit more clear. That was definitely one of the thoughts I had while going over this. But yeah, I definitely think this is a chapter we'll keep coming back to. So I can make those changes that we talked about and then send a fresh draft, so that we make sure all those changes are made. Yeah.
So, and again, I did this after sending you all of the documents to make comments on, but I have reformatted into the format that we agreed upon. So I'll send you that in Word.
Perfect. Would be great.
So we do have some time left, and since we do have Meredith, do we want to jump to the state laws and the packet that she gave us in December, or?
Which it might even be helpful. I mean, I can kind of give a broad overview or kind of point out, because most of these I've kind of picked out where they might fit into the ordinance, and some of these are more just things to be aware of versus things that necessarily have to be included. So just things to think about. And I think two major things in here are the state's changing definition of subdivision as well as accessory dwelling units. So I spent a decent amount of time looking at the new laws for that. And I think in general, we should consider adding in a section, maybe under performance standards for ADUs, since there are a lot of new regulations around ADUs and municipal requirements. So that I think will be kind of a longer discussion, which maybe would be better for a later time when we get to that point. But let me know what would be most helpful for now.
Yeah, I think if you want to give us an overview, I think, we're focusing on certain chapters at a time, so I think trying to dive into this whole thing is going to be a little overwhelming with all of the new laws. So I think it's best that we tackle them, or it would be my suggestion that we tackle them per chapter.
yeah, I would agree.
But I think an overview would be great at this point.
Yeah, sure. So I know it's a pretty large packet, so I, again, tried to kind of distill it and then pick out where things might best fit in. So at the beginning, which I might not go completely in order, but on that first page for Shoreland District, there's a new requirement for sellers of residential property to disclose if there's been a shoreland violation, and to provide any purchaser of property, the notice, and any other information regarding pending enforcement action. So something to consider adding that could be in section 6.1, or it could be 8.6 for under legal action and violations. That could be something just to include there so that sellers are aware of that requirement if there are violations of shoreline zoning that are issued. But just a small point there. And then the other one on that page beneath that, LD 65. So that really just involves the definition of coastal wetlands. So that could be something that we talk about when we're adding that as a new definition. I think that could easily fit into 9.1. And that definition's just been expanded to include pretty much all tidal lowlands and other salt vegetation areas. And then the next few go over accessory dwelling units and go over
Meredith.
several different requirements that have now been added. So for fire protection, it just is clarifying that fire suppression sprinklers are not required for ADUs unless it's attached to a structure with more than 2 dwelling units. And then density requirements. This new law basically just talks about whether a municipality can enact a rate of growth ordinance that limits residential development in designated growth areas. So that's prohibiting municipalities from doing that. And then under the height allowance, we also have a municipality, an affordable housing development, which I don't know if that is really an issue for Denmark or whether that's, something that needs to be included. Again, that's just kind of an additional requirement specifically for affordable housing developments, and allowing them to increase municipal height restrictions by 1 story or 14 feet or more. Plumbing inspection requirements, that can also be included. And then, like I mentioned, accessory dwelling units. So that's going to be a much longer section. And I actually talked to Lindsay a little bit about this law. Currently, the legislature has passed 2 different versions of the law that are in conflict with each other. So we're essentially in a waiting period of waiting for them to clarify, since they aren't directly in conflict but have differing regulations. So something to think about and something I'll be kind of tracking as that moves forward. But I think in general, accessory dwelling units are going to be a longer conversation that we can revisit, and same thing with subdivisions. And then another thing to point out that I think is important, there has been a new requirement for any planning board officer or any municipal regulatory committee, anyone that does that hears zoning appeals. They have to go to a training on land use planning that's offered by a state agency within 180 days of appointment, or if one is not offered at the next available training. So just something to be aware of there, that is a new requirement that's been added.
So, and to my knowledge, they do not
Yeah.
have that training yet?
That's
okay.
what I thought. I had looked into it, and I don't think they've actually developed it yet, but something to be aware of for the future.
So before we move on, if I could just ask one question, because again, we get this all the time. So in our comprehensive plan, we do not designate growth areas. We say that Denmark is not conducive to growth areas. And so how does that play into all of these new laws that keep referring to growth areas?
It's a good question, and I was wondering that when I was going over it, because I thought that was the case with Denmark. So I can look into it a little bit more and come back with a little bit more information about how we would deal with that, because there are not a lot of new statutes being passed that do affect growth areas. So I think it's worth looking into a little bit more and confirming those requirements. So I can make a note of that and get back to you.
Okay.
I have another question too, sorry. Going back to the coastal wetlands, why would we have anything in our ordinance with having to do with that?
Yeah, again, we don't have to include everything. These are mainly just a summary of all potentially relevant laws that have been passed and have made changes. And if there was any reference in here that required it, which I don't think that there is, I can do another search of the ordinance just to be sure. But again, some of these won't be, they're not required to be added, but good to be aware of.
Okay.
And in your research in doing so, can you see if the location in which the growth area is located, if it's like towards the center of town or there's a certain distance away from a village district like we have, or if that's in there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Good point. All right, so if there's no other questions, I think we can table, like I said, the subdivision and accessory dwelling units. Those are the majority of the applicable changes. So I think we can come back to that at a later point when it makes more sense.
Or sewer? No.
Just checking. Wondering that earlier.
So we already have standards on hazard trees, storm damaged trees, and dead tree removals.
We do, but there's a new now law that defines definition, so. That defines litter, sorry.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it's just a small change to the definition just now. I think it's including brush. It's just a small change there for the definition.
Agriculture damage.
So, and I don't think under our ordinance, we actually deal with kennels, do we? I don't believe so.
No, we had something in there because there is one kennel in town. But I don't remember where it is.
Okay. So, and this time, I don't think we have anything either about boathouses, just to say that they're not allowed. in our current ordinance.
Boathouses or houseboats?
I think you mean houseboats?
Oh, sorry, houseboats,
houseboats.
sorry.
Houseboats.
We
We've got
do
a lot
have
of
boat,
boathouses.
yes, we do have boat house.
But that does say boathouses.
This does say boathouses.
It does, yeah.
In our ordinance, we do have the agriculture and animal husbandry, but there's nothing in here, it doesn't delineate kennels.
Okay, I didn't think so.
No.
Did you say there is a kennel in town?
There is.
Yes.
Okay.
And again, I think it was already handled under Department of Agriculture. It was,
It was before my time, so I can't
Yeah.
really speak to it.
actually, it was handled through the dog officer at that time. So we don't have, just looking through these, so like the fire bank, there is actually the established one in Bridgeton that actually also covers Denmark.
Firewood,
Firewood. yes.
firewood bank, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, so that's page 11, so that would be the one,
Yeah.
the LD 1525.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right,
Yeah, Bridgeton has one, right?
Right.
Yep. I'll just keep reading through these and seeing.
So, I mean, I think a lot of this will not pertain. But as Meredith said, the subdivision and the ADU and the growth, I think, are the three
Right.
major areas.
Yep, I would agree.
well, we don't have a firewood bank now, but should we include something in here for the potential that one might be established? Knowing that the one
Yeah.
in Bridgeton is used quite a bit,
Mm-hmm.
expanding it to this area.
So that's something we could put under performance standards, probably, is a section for, and I think we know that we're gonna be putting in performance standards for self-storage, so LD 1391 will come into play.
Got that, Casey?
So unless anyone else, I mean, I think that's a good
think that's-
overview. And this will be a good reference once we start again into either performance standards or specific chapters.
I would agree. So did we want to look at chapter 2, or did we want to table that, given the time?
We,
Or did you have something else? Did we skip over something?
so I think the only thing with like chapter 2 that I had put on here was, again, just kind of looking at what I've started, and this was something, this was something that I again took from Bridgeton's model. I liked how they really broke down like whose responsibility it is to administer what within the ordinance. So before I continued any further, I just kind of wanted to see what thoughts were of the committee. So you can see, I just started this with, you know, code enforcement, and then broke into planning board, then appeals board. And then some other sections here that I've suggested that obviously I haven't, you know, dove into yet. So just kind of getting a feedback. I have a template that in Word for this reformatting. So you're gonna see, and I'll try to change these, but I think it's going to mess it up once I start combining chapters. They're all gonna say Article 1, even though that's not the chapter they're gonna be in. But because we're doing this per chapter, I have to keep each of those separate, and then I can start combining them. And once I combine them, then it will renumber like those. But if I can find a way to actually put the correct article number in there, I will. It took me a long time to get to where I am. So I think at that point I abandoned it and didn't look any further into it. It just said,
It definitely is more visually appealing for sure, like at least from what I'm looking at. It makes it pretty clear, right to the point. Takes out paragraphs and paragraphs of stuff that we just kept regurgitating in spots.
I don't know how you dealt with that old one.
I think my only thing is on A1A is appointed in accordance with the town charter. It's also in accordance with state law. Appointed, not elected. Like the rest of the CEOs in the country are appointed per state law. My only note on that one.
Okay. So I guess you're really asking us is that towards the end where you just basically you ask the questions like what activities do not require permits? Like, do we want to continue like that, kind of like what Bridgeton more or less
Correct.
sort of does? I think if you're picking up a book for the first time, like reading that would help guide you more so than someone who's more familiar with it. You know, asking these kind of prompts and questions like what approvals are needed, what permits are required. I think that would help the average person who's doing it.
Agreed, because now you can go on the website and you can see permits, but if you can look and say, okay, you need a permit for this, this, and this, but you don't know that until you look at the website and and those are the only ones that are listed there. So I totally agree with you on that, that would be helpful for users.
You know, I think one of my perhaps concerns, but I think it needs to be, it just, like, as I was doing this, I'm like, this is gonna be like a long chapter. But I think for it to be clear, for it to be precise, you know, we're gonna need all of these lists.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, I agree, I think it's easier to read. Okay, you know, if you look in the planning board, what authority does the planning board have? What types of applications do they decide on? And,
I certainly would be in favor of moving forward in that direction.
so I can continue with that, and then at the next meeting, have something to actually review for administration.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
Keep moving forward.
So is chapter 2 the only thing we're gonna look at or go back through, or agenda-wise?
Well, I think agenda-wise, if Meredith gets back to us what we've spoken about tonight, we can review those.
Okay.
And then chapter 2,
Okay.
the new chapter 2, which is the current chapter 8. I keep trying to make these references, but
Right, yeah. Okay. Yeah, it definitely gives us enough to talk about. And we'll probably just go through your whole chapter 2 as it's written, right? And make grammatical
Right.
changes, everything,
Yeah.
go through the
Yeah.
whole, yep. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Does anybody have anything else? Public comment? No one's here? Meredith, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to what you have to come up with. And do we have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
is our next meeting,
Oh, yeah,
Sorry.
let's set that quick. Let's figure out our
All right, well, good to see you all. Betty, I'll send those materials over to you, and if you want to send me the Word document
Yes.
with the changes that you've already made, that would be perfect.
all right, I will do that. I'll get
Thank
it to
you.
you. Thank
you,
you.
Meredith.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, February.
So,
March 4th.
March 4th.
March 4th.
March 4th.
Yeah.
Same day, different month.
Yep.
Yep, well, when you have 28 days.
PC, done, save. Easy enough. Anything else got on your mind? No? Motion to adjourn?
Second.
There we go.
There we go.